Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Well, at least it's a beautiful afternoon in Paris, and a very warm welcome to all of those in different time zones. It's quite an exciting trip around the world. If you look at the chat box, um, I do wonder when we'll actually be able to visit all those places. Um, let's let's start it then. My name is Guillaume Lepec. I am the chair of CashEssentials, and we'll be hosting this webinar this afternoon. We had initially designed this project as an interactive workshop to be held at the Future of Cash conference in April in Madrid, now rescheduled in February. But we thought we'd like to share with you some of the findings of this ongoing project. There's a bit of frustration because this was initially designed as an interactive co-design project, and we're using what proved to be very non-interactive and impersonal tools to do this. But that's the situation. On the other hand, it's an honor and somewhat overwhelming to see that we had at my last count 370 people registered for this event, and as you can see, from all over the world. So again, welcome to all. First of all, let me start with some housekeeping guidelines. Due to the number and the technology, unfortunately, we need to we have switched off your mics and cameras. So feel free to sing out loud if you wish to. And the interaction will be limited to the chat panel as well as the Q&A. So I see many of you have found them, but the chat box is circled in red on the screenshot, and the Q&A. The chat panel is in green, and the Q&A in red. So if you wish to submit questions, and please do that in the Q&A section. Lastly, this session is recorded, and the recording will be made available following the session. For those of you who are not familiar with CashEssentials, we are a young and small organization, but strive to become a platform for discussion and debate on cash and its future, on payments, as well as monetary ecosystems. We have a website, a newsletter, which you're welcome to visit. We publish various white papers and reports, and occasionally we do slightly more novel things, such as organizing photo competitions and exhibitions around the theme of cash. Now, it's to put the future of cash into perspective, it's always interesting to have a look at this remarkable chart produced by Helmut Stix and Clemens Jobst from the Austrian National Bank. And it measures the evolution of cash in circulation in relation to GDP for 6 currencies over the past 150 years. And I'd just like to highlight 3 points. Firstly, if you observe the trends between 1875 and the late 20th century, you will see a decline in the level of cash in circulation, but it is far from uniform. It's quite surprising that in the case of the US dollar, for instance, the currency in circulation was at the same level in 2000 as it was in 1900. So again, I think this historical perspective makes us or forces us to reframe the story. Secondly, we can observe massive spikes, which correspond to the major crises of the last century: the First World War, the Great Depression, and of course the Second World War. And it's noteworthy to see that these spikes have a massive and long-lasting effect on demand. If you look at the Swiss franc, which is the top dark green line, it has taken over 50 years for the Swiss franc to go back to pre-depression levels of the late 20s. And the third point is that towards the end of the 20th century, we've seen a reversal of this downward trend. And we're seeing cash in circulation rise again against GDP in all 6 currencies. And in the case of the euro and the Swiss franc, the growth rates have been quite spectacular. And I'd just like to draw two conclusions at this point. And the first is that the evolution of cash demand is not linear. And the second is that we actually haven't been very good at forecasting or modeling this. And this is why we decided to look at a different approach to think about the future of cash. And we looked at futures literacy. Now, I've borrowed this definition from UNESCO, and I know that the head of the Futures Literacy Program at UNESCO, Real Miller, is on this webinar. So, Real, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. UNESCO defines futures literacy as a capability, a skill, a little bit like reading or carpentry. And UNESCO is actually championing the development of futures literacy methods in education, government agencies, civil society, as well as the private sector, as a tool to empower us to learn how to imagine the future. We'll come back to futures literacy in a few minutes. But it is now high time for me to introduce our panel. And in alphabetical order, I present Diederik Bruhink, Head of Innovation and Payments at the European Savings and Retail Banking Group. Diederik also sits on the board of the European Payments Council and chairs the Cash Efficiency Working Group. On Diederik's right, we have Antti Heinonen, Chairman of the Banknote Ethics Initiative and former head of banknotes at the ECB. Below Antti, we have Franz Seitz. He's an economist and teaches at the Weiden Technical University, where his main fields of research are monetary theory and policy, financial markets, banking, and payments, including cash, of course. And last but not least, we have Petteri Lillberg. And we to carry out this project, CashEssentials decided to partner with Demos Helsinki, a think tank. Petteri has been involved in this initiative from the outstart. Our program for today, Petteri will give us an introduction to futures literacy, and that will be followed by views, a futures table, and how to use it. And then we'll take questions and then conclude. And now I'm going to hand over to Petteri.
All right. Thank you, and very much welcome on my behalf as well. I am not going to spend, and thank you, Kion, for the kind introduction. Uh, as I said, today we're framing the cash debate within our ability to imagine and reimagine futures. And really we do that because we want to better understand the present and start innovating from new, fresh perspectives. This may sound quite self-evident, but often in reality, we often act as if the future is predetermined without our own ability to make an impact. And this is why we think, and why I quite strongly feel about this, is where futures literature really comes into play. Where we start within our consultancy is that future is an organizational and, as I think many would argue, a citizen skill for the 21st century, whose importance we feel, and I think lots of in the audience will feel, that the current crisis has only heightened. Uh, Now, pretty much all thinking we feel benefits from having a clearly structured model. And today's, some of you may be familiar with this, but today's key tool is something we call a futures table. And futures table is a really simple, though not a simplified tool or simplistic, designed to look at and analyze current tensions and understand their outcomes by identifying really three things: tensions, which are the defining phenomena of our times; variables, which are the different change factors within the tensions; and values, i.e., the possible development directions for these factors. And by combining variables and values in a non-linear, not as a straight line, we can identify, either as organizations or societies or even as individuals, a diversity of possible futures. And quite importantly, and this is why future in itself may not be important, but what you do with your future starting now we feel is a priority, is to really work out an agency and role in creating a future. And we hope that today's webinar is really a demonstration of how we build a table for future of cash in practice. And 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 we will in fact share a sample table towards the end, so please stay tuned. It's really a sample, and you'll see that we have identified a number of factors, a number of values, but obviously we encourage everybody in the audience to work out their own in the coming future. Now, the list you're now seeing is by no means exhaustive, but or that it covers everything. But we think it represents quite well some of the most fundamental tensions that the current pandemic has heightened. And all of them require debate and discussion now, but also importantly, beyond the corona. The first tension, which we focus, is our global economy, and in particular, who, or in fact, what leads the eventual recovery, because there will be a recovery. I would argue. The greatest tension we think is whether our recovery will be led by strong, competitive national economies or regimes, or perhaps global, independent, and rule-based frameworks. And whatever the leadership will be, it will have several implications, for example, for the nature of resilience of future supply chains and other global systems. Second, we think the tension that may have differing outcomes is the large debate on privacy. The pandemic has opened up demands for a new kind of digital surveillance. And in fact, if we look at crisis prior to this current one, we know that any any surveillance tool that's introduced in the neighbor of a crisis, they tend to stay. So obviously there is a big tension and probably a need for a thorough debate. What are the outer limits of our privacy, or in fact right to be anonymous? The third tension is to debate what, if any, are the planetary boundaries for our economic growth. In particular, as economies currently are being pumped taxpayer, public money, the direction and the purpose of that money is paramount. And in fact, many see this as an opportunity to speed up the transformation towards a more sustainable, greener economy. A debate most national economies or economies based on regional frameworks are currently going through. Fourth, the tension, there's a long-standing tension, again, between the big tech-driven platform economy and the public governance. And that is a tension that is by no means going away. Rather, I think we are seeing a debate how much all that data different platforms currently and in the future gather, how much of that is used for public good, or whether all that data will remain within private, commercial driven domains. Last but not least, there's a real and ongoing debate as to which are the development paths regarding money, payment means, and indeed cash. There's a tension between centrally issued and packed, diverse payment systems that are universally and equally accepted, or who knows, privately issued and fragmented payment systems that really work only inside their own ecosystems. And I will now return later in this webinar with a future table based on these tensions. But now I would like to give floor to Guillaume and the voice of the experts who will go through the tensions and the variables and the possible directions within them.
Yeah, now we all switch to our three experts, and I'd like to start with Diederik from the European Savings Bank Group.
Thank you very much, Guillaume and Petteri, for the introductions. And as you can see on this slide, one of the tensions mentioned is the one on money that I am planning to cover here. The views that I express here are my own and not necessarily representing those of the European Savings and Retail Banking Group or its members. And to start, indeed, if we want to understand the future, someone said you also have to look at the past. So I will start initially, whilst focusing on Europe, look a bit on how at least some of the transaction patterns evolved over time. And what you can see here on this slide, which is probably difficult to see on the screens you have in front of here, are at least the different buckets of payment instruments that are being reported to the European Central Bank. And basically what you see here, the buckets of credit transfers, direct debits, checks, e-money, other means, and those of cards. But what is key to understand here is that in 2018, the last year for which figures were available, almost 142 billion cashless transactions were made in the European Union as a whole, showing a growth rate of 7.6% year over year. This includes the UK, and what you can also see here is that on the one hand, cards take the most significant part of it, namely 54% of all transactions. On top of that, it's also showing the strongest growth rates, at 10.9% year-on-year growth in card transactions. Other areas where we see growth is credit transfers and direct debits, which are maybe less suitable for consumer payments. But an area also worth mentioning is that of e-money that shows a nearly 80% growth rate. Again, these figures include the EU, including the United Kingdom. Just for the sake of references, I have also excluded the UK from this figure. Also at that point in time, because UK is leaving the EU by the end of this year, we still have 110 billion cashless transactions in the Union, showing again a 7.6 growth rate. But then the share of card transactions is a bit less. But on the end, the growth rate of card transactions is a bit stronger than with the UK included, namely 11.4%. Of course, cards are not the only transaction means that are being used to purchase goods. And most of you are aware that in 2017, the European Central Bank published a paper, the use of cash by households in the euro area, which was basically based on diaries and surveys, which consumers were asked on the way they paid. And here in this graph, you can see the blue bars basically representing the number of cash transactions per day per consumer. And in orange, you see the transactions by cards in consumers. It's sorted from the heaviest cash users in number of transactions towards the less. And you see that typically there's a kind of a distinction between the southern part of Europe and the more western, northern-oriented parts. Of course, at some point in time, we're still looking to the back, the COVID crisis start to kick in. And of course, this had some impact on the way people transacted. And if I'm not mistaken, you should be able to see a poll on your screen where you're basically being asked, since the corona crisis started to hit you in your region, has your transaction behavior changed in number of transactions? Have you made less payment transactions? Have your payment transactions remained the same? Or have you made more payment transactions during this crisis? While the poll is still running, you see again huge differences exist between these particular countries in Europe. So that's also key to understand. There's no such a thing as United States of Europe, but Europe still consists of individual member states with different cultural habits and way payments are being made. But if we look a bit closer at the data that has become available, and here I take a more global picture on data that has been provided by the card schemes, you see here the graphs that has been provided to the investors of those card schemes, basically indicating from the moment the crisis start to kick in. The left part of the graph is usually somewhere in February, March timeframe. You see an immediate decrease in the number of transactions. The left two graphs are basically just let's say the regular type of card transactions that you see declining. The good news, however, is that over time you see it increasing as well. These are figures comparing last year's volume in the same period compared to this year's volume. And you see this is the bar that is zero. We are still in the negative on both counts. On the right-hand side of the graph, you see especially the transactions in the cross-border area, the international transactions, an area that's typically an area where cards are being used by travelers. But as the name says it is also very vulnerable to travel. You see, for example, that, for example, the orange line over here, which is the card present transaction, really using the physical card at the point of sale, is suffering significantly and is still underwater there. If we look at the same graphs for Visa, basically you see the same pattern, steep decreases and in the meanwhile slightly recovering. If I go back to look what you answered to the poll, I noticed that 80% of the respondents indicated that they made less payment transactions during the period. 13% has the same number of transactions, and 7% start even to make more transactions over time. I think, generally speaking, this is the line what these two graphs are showing us. So to wrap up for my first part of this particular intervention, looking back what happened, The whole COVID-19 crisis hit the industry by surprise. Let there be no doubt about it. And at the announcement of the lockdowns, the banks observed a steep increase in cash withdrawals, both in terms of volumes as well as in values, meaning that some hoarding took place and people went out to secure some stash for worse times. Shortly after, we saw that cashless payments started to be promoted. On the one hand, because there was some fake news out there as banknotes would help spread the virus. But on the other hand, also promoted by the raise of contactless limits and the promotion of contactless payments to make sure that people didn't have to touch the pinpoints every time they made a transaction. So shortly after, we saw a decrease in cash withdrawals, and we have shown reports down of 50% of pre-COVID-19 levels. But in parallel, also, we saw a steep decrease in the normal card transactions, down to 70 to 80% of pre-COVID-19 levels. So that's really explainable because most countries went in lockdown. We saw also shifting to remote transactions. People started to order stuff and food online. And we also noticed that as part of the crisis, some other issues appeared, especially in the area of chargebacks and refunds, and especially in the travel and entertainment segment. You can imagine that some bank acquirers even observe negative volumes. Because basically the business model that most travel entities work with is you pay now for your flight later. And if people now start calling that money back, it basically generates a negative liquidity flow, which is also not very good and sustainable for the interview. And I leave it here. The question at the moment is what will be the impact on the customer behavior in the future? Whether restrictions will be relieved is yet unclear. What we saw in the graphs of Visa and MasterCard, we saw some slight increases in those areas where the lockdowns restrictions have been ended, but we're not there yet. And on that bombshell, I give the floor back to Guillaume. Thank you.
Thanks, thank you, Diederik. And now let me ask the same question to Antti. Antti?
Many thanks, Guillaume. So, good morning or afternoon, everybody. Before I start exploring what will drive the future of cash in the next decade, it is useful to know where we are now. In that respect, I have two slides. So in this slide, I have the annual growth rates in the value of banknotes in circulation, and as you can see, they vary significantly. So we have a number of currencies which have very high growth rates on the right-hand side, and also a small number of cases where the growth rates are negative. So this is a snapshot. So I have another second slide here where the situation is compared between 2018 and 2016. And you see that the distributions are very similar, although the growth rates were on average a bit higher in 2016. So countries and currencies are in different phases with respect to the usage of non-cash payment instruments and the financial inclusion of citizens in general. Considering the most important aspect of change presented by Petteri earlier, these 5 tensions, I find very improbable a future scenario in which each currency would suddenly have the same payment landscape. Therefore, my first conclusion is that one size doesn't fit all in the foreseeable future. So also in the future, we will have currencies in different phases. Didrik already elaborated the first experiences regarding consumer behavior during this pandemic. One of them was a strong spike in the demand for cash in many countries at the announcement of restrictions and lockdowns. The learning from this consumer behavior is twofold. First, during uncertainty, people make precautions for all circumstances and rely on a payment instrument that is generally trusted and accepted. So far, there is no other payment instrument than cash that fills these criteria. The second learning is that central banks should be prepared for exceptional demands for cash and make their cash supply system resilient. I will now focus on the first point, reliance on cash as a precaution. And the question is naturally, will similar behavior continue also in the future? All central banks have in their statutes, in one form or the other, the statement that they are responsible for the promotion of smooth operation of the payment systems. Recent developments in the digital payment sphere show that central banks are not ready to leave the payment infrastructure fully to the private sector. The digital payment instruments by the private sector simultaneously with the decreasing share of cash in transactions have led a number of central banks to explore central bank digital currency. Does this mean that central banks have placed their bet on a digital cash instead of physical cash? Not necessarily, at least on the basis of the survey published by Central Banking less than 2 weeks ago. 80% of the central banks who responded to the survey had no plans at all to issue a central bank digital currency, even if they were studying the matter. Furthermore, even those central banks which consider issuing digital currency during the next 5 years are not planning to skip cash. This leads to my second conclusion. I don't find probable a future scenario in which central banks wouldn't continue to support physical cash as a trusted part of the public infrastructure. I will elaborate the implications of these conclusions in my second intervention later. Thank you, Guillaume.
Antti, thank you very much. And now let's turn to our economist, Franz Seitz.
So thank you very much, Guillaume. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. What I want to do in what follows in the next 5 minutes is to draw your attention to two, as I call it, stylized facts with respect to cash, which happen to be there in the last, say, decade since the Lehman collapse, and which I would forecast would also be present in the next few years. So what are these two stylized facts? The first one is, when you look at transactional demand for cash, that is the share of cash at the point of sale, you see a worldwide tendency that the share of cash used at the point of sale is decreasing. Here in this figure, you see it for 7 countries. only, but it is also true for African countries, for Australia, and so on and so forth. The share of cash, even if it's on different levels, the share of cash is decreasing. This figure is calculated relative to the number of transactions, and you see for Germany it's around 80%, but decreasing. For Sweden, it's very low now, only 10%. If you would calculate this figure with respect to the value of transactions, surely the figures would be much lower, as many small transactions are undertaken by cash. That is, as we economists call it, the share of cash in transactions is decreasing due to the prevalence and importance of cashless payments media, cards, and so on. First stylized fact. But on the other side, when you look at total cash in circulation, what we also see in the last decade, since the Lehman collapse, is an increase in total cash in circulation in nearly every country all over the world. The only big exception is Sweden, and I've to give you an impression about that, I've calculated total cash in circulation relative to GDP here for 8 countries, and you see even relative to GDP, it has increased in many countries. See, in Japan, it has increased. It's over 20% now. In Sweden, it has decreased, but not drastically. In many countries, it has remained stable, which means cash in circulation increased in the same way as GDP. In Switzerland, it has increased. In China, it has decreased, but still is at 8% of GDP. And when we look at the world in total and compare, here I did it for the year 2018 to the year 2011, the share of cash in GDP was 10% in 2018 and is 8% and against 8% in 2011. And the question is, how can we reconcile these two stylized facts? Obviously, there are some determinants of cash holdings which more than compensate the decreasing transactional demand. And surely there are these other motives for holding cash, which I've summarized here. You see, the first 2 points are domestic transactional demand, which is declining due to the availability of alternative means of payment. But then there are many other more motives for holding cash. Some call it hoarding or store of value purposes or opportunity costs, low interest rates, mistrust in the financial system. And the question is whether and why these other determinants have increased in importance in the last decade. Has mistrust in the financial and banking system increased since the financial crisis? Yeah, probably yes. Size of the shadow economy? Probably no. Precautionary demand and crisis-related demand? I will only remind the financial crisis, the euro area sovereign debt crisis, or now the corona crisis, which has surely increased. Disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, uncertainty-related demand, and also foreign demand. Foreign demand is special in the sense that it's only important for the well-known currencies with high reputation as the US dollar or the euro or also the Swiss franc. It's not easy to calculate the relevance and importance of these motives. We have done it for the case of Germany together with 2 colleagues, and we've seen that only 5 to 10% of the cumulated net issuance of Germany, a country within a monetary union, is used for domestic transactions. 20 to 24% are used for other motives, all summarized here under the notion store of value. And the rest, that is 7%, is used in other countries, 25% in other euro area countries, and 45% in countries outside the euro area. And in my second 5 minutes, I will then raise some questions and implications of these evolutions. Thank you very much. And now I hand over to Guillaume once again.
Thank you, Franz. And now let's switch back to Diederik.
Thank you, Guillaume. And to continue where we left us, what we've seen happening also, apart from the COVID crisis hitting, previously some other forces where we're looking at the payments area and structures here in Europe as well. For example, the European Commission has, together with the European Central Bank, considers it key that the international role of the euro is being strengthened. And they also consider it key that European sovereignty in payments is important, that should be safeguarded. So to that end, they are pretty much in favor of a new initiative launched in Europe called Instant Payments, which basically allows people to make a transfer from one bank account to another bank account across Europe 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and also during weekends and holidays, so 365 days a week. And as this is a European product, a European invention, it could very well fit these requirements and expectations as set out by the regulator. So this instant payment product has been launched in 2017, and critical mass is expected by 2020. Of course, teething pains still persist, but the banking industry is working hard to try to resolve that. The Commission has set clear expectations on this, and it is very likely also to become part of a wider integrated EU payment strategy that the Commission announced to launch or to basically make public at the third quarter of 2020. That might slip a bit due to the current COVID crisis. But for those interested as part of this legislative process, the Commission also launched a consultation on retail payments, and those interested are invited to also respond to that consultation. There are also some questions on cash in there. And as I stated before, there's no such a thing as the United States of Europe. We saw in the previous statistics that there was some quite seemingly common behavior when it comes to cashless payments. But if we zoom in on the different countries, like I did on this particular graph, you see in the different color the different type of payment products that are being supported and the relative share they have in the total amount of transactions in these countries. For example, you see some users of checks still. You see some heavy users of cards marked in green. Other countries with large amounts of credit transfers. But the key of this picture is to understand that there are different habits in each of the different countries. And of course, having all these cashless transactions in mind, and we will look at cash later on. I also launched an other poll, basically trying to gauge your views on how your transaction behavior has changed. Have you started to use less cash, more cash, or the same amount cash as before when the COVID crisis hit in? And whilst you're still working on the questions, again, some look back into history. Over the same period as I showed this increase in these cashless transactions over time. Bit contrary to what you would expect, we saw also an increase in cash in circulation, both in terms of absolute number of banknotes, which shows a year-on-year growth of 5.2%, as you can see on the left graph here, but also as a percentage of GDP, also showing a 1.2% growth rate year over year. Interestingly, though, if you look at how this cash is being distributed to the public, and the natural distribution points for that are either the bank branches and the ATMs of the banks, both of these distribution points show a decrease year over year. Bank offices are closing with a minus 5.2% rate over year, whilst the number of ATMs also seem to decreasing at close to minus 2% rate. And that has led to some concerns voiced by consumer associations here in Brussels, who believe that access to cash is something that becomes a kind of even political or policy type of discussion, where these consumer associations are demanding that basically access to cash should be almost a kind of fundamental right. Access to cash should be widely available, free of charge, and ATMs or distribution websites should be freely and geographically distributed across the United European Union. If you look back to the poll I just raised, most of you, 76%, indicated that the share of cash transactions in their transaction behavior has decreased. 16% indicated that the level stayed the same, and 8% started to use more cash during the crisis. Again, indeed, that also confirms the previous made observations that there were some significant changes in customer behavior. Having said that, the key question now is, of course, what to expect. It's still unclear how customer behavior will change when the restrictions will be lifted. We see increase in transactions, but it is both on card and cashless transactions as well as in cash withdrawals. That's positive because it also means that the economy is starting up again. A key question that's also getting the attention here of the competition authorities, even here in Brussels, is whether the current crisis didn't cause an opportunity for some type of e-wallets or e-wallet type of payment methods to lock in their customers and hence blocking the entrance of new parties in the competitive sphere. That's a question to remain seen. Also, what will be the impact on the lower volumes on the actors in the cash business should the trend continue? Although I would expect that the cash behavior will also start growing again back to healthy volumes, meaning that the business underlying might be more sustainable. Of course, also in light of the access to cash discussion that we can expect to happen later on. But also a question will be, will there still be investment appetite to invest in new digital payment methods, given that the changes were there and some parties are really hit due to high level of chargebacks and refunds that are difficult to process. So unfortunately, I don't have the answers also what to expect, but I'm pretty sure that the consumers at the end of the day will hold the key on what will happen, and they will be the judge initially to predict what type of payment methods they will prefer. And with that, my intervention here is finished, so I hand it back over to Guillaume. Thank you.
Thanks, Diederik. Quite a few interesting ideas raised there. And now let me hand over to Antti again.
Thank you, Guillaume. I mentioned in my first intervention that one of the learnings of the pandemic is that central banks should make their cash supply system resilient to exceptional demands and runs to cash. This means a reassessment of the stock management policies, but also production, procurement, and processing arrangements in potential lockdown situations. Efficiency has been one of the key words recently, not only in cash management, but also in other industries. It is evident that in the future it will be reflected more against business continuity. An even more challenging question is how central banks should organize the resilience of the cash supply system in case the access to and acceptance of cash is declining significantly during normal times. You cannot have cash as a fallback in a crisis if the infrastructure is not regularly used and available. So cost efficiency will lose importance also in this respect. If market forces would not guarantee the existence of a functioning cash infrastructure, central banks should consider ensuring the access to and acceptance of cash by regulation or by subsidizing it. Besides the health concerns, the most severe consequences of COVID-19 are its economic impacts. Most organizations are currently focusing on the short-term impacts because of the uncertainties of how long the restrictions will last. Will there be a second or third wave? When the vaccine will be available, etc. The responses will, however, most likely take several years. The crisis could push over 500 million people into poverty unless urgent and dramatic action is taken. Based on the last global Findex database from 2017, still 1.7 billion adults didn't have a bank account. According to Oxfam, focusing on the alleviation of global poverty, cash grants and other forms of universal social protection can play a huge role in tackling inequality and protecting vulnerable people, and they are critical in response to this crisis. So, according to Oxfam, cash grant is a form of universal protection. Universal protection to vulnerable people. As James Shepherd Barron writes in his recent blog on the CashEssentials website, almost all so-called digital transfers require cashing out at some point in the payment cycle because merchants don't have access to the electronic point of purchase, mobile transfer apps, or banking platforms required to process them. Thank you, Guillaume. That was my second set of conclusions regarding what will drive the future of cash in.
So, given what I've shown you and said to you in the first slot, I had decreasing transactional demand and increasing total demand for cash. This, in my view, raises a lot, or at least some important questions or has important implications with respect to the future, to the next years. The first question I want to raise is there a lower threshold? What do I mean by that? I mean, we do not have to go to zero, that is to abolish cash altogether. Is there a lower threshold in the share of transactions at the point of sale below which it is no longer profitable or useful for retailers to accept cash and for banks to supply cash? And if this is the case, and Antti has already mentioned this, then perhaps retailers would stop accepting cash, banks would stop providing cash, and if there then is a disaster, a crisis period where cash has proven to be very useful, then cash won't work, the cash system won't work in such a crisis period too. And does that mean that then not only the share of cash in transaction declines or approaches zero, but also that the other motives for holding cash become less relevant, and then that there is a decreasing demand from these other perspectives too? I don't have the exact answer, but I think that should be taken into account, and perhaps we should look in this direction to Sweden, where perhaps this lower bound has been already reached. Second is cash, crisis, and central bank digital currencies. Central bank digital currencies are also already mentioned. What do I mean? This is related to my first point, the lower threshold, the lower bound. If there is a decreasing cash demand, not only for transactions, but also as this lower threshold is reached, a decreasing demand for other reasons, then my argument would be there would be enormous pressure on central banks to issue another form of central bank money, not physical central bank money, but digital central bank money. And especially against the background of the initiatives undertaken by private entities like Bitcoin, like Libra, and so on, there would be enormous pressure. And this then would have, in my view, enormous consequences on the economy as a whole, on financial markets, on financial market participants, on financial market stability, and so on and so forth. And this is, to my view, an indication that you should really think very deeply about such a thing as to reach this lower threshold and then to issue central bank digital currencies, because if once you have reached this lower threshold or even abolished cash, then you can no longer reintroduce cash if it is needed. You should think about it carefully before and then decide. Next point is the role of negative interest rates, which in my view is the relevant scenario in the next few years. Again, against the background of the corona crisis, very low or even negative interest rates, which means that opportunity costs of holding cash are really high. Up to now, negative interest rates are most of all relevant for banks. And when I show you their reaction on the next slide, what you see here is only the situation in Germany, the vault cash, that is the cash holdings of banks in Germany. The European Central Bank has introduced the first negative interest rates on deposits of banks at the Euro system in 2014. And see what happened to the cash holdings of banks. They have nearly tripled from 15 to 16 billion euros up to nearly 44 billion euros. And if these negative interest rate would become more widespread for customers too, for small customers too. We've also seen negative interest rates on sovereign bonds in Germany, 10 years, even 10-year sovereign bonds yields have been negative. This would, in my view, really increase the demand for cash drastically. And if this is the relevant scenario in the next years, then this would, from this perspective, increase the demand for cash. And then a point which is relevant then for nearly all 3 points I've mentioned before. What is the role of central banks in all these? Yeah, for negative interest rates, surely not. Central banks are not the only player or the only institution which is relevant for negative interest rates. There are other developments to take into account too, but there are one important player as they set the short-term interest rate. Supplying of central bank digital currencies, quite natural, a task of central banks. Up to now, central banks' position with respect to payments is a neutral position. They don't discriminate between the different payment methods, cash or cashless. In my view, they should really think about that position if that can if it makes sense to any longer really stick to this position. In my view, against the background of the negative consequences of more and more decreasing and of perhaps reaching this lower threshold, or against the propositions of abolishing cash and the negative consequences which have shown of such a situation, central banks should give up their neutral position and try to actively promote cash payments and the supply of cash.
I really enjoyed the expert views and hope everybody else has enjoyed as well. What we've seen is that these our esteemed experts going through some of the variables within the tensions. So we've covered, and I know we are even over time now. We've covered money, we've covered economic recovery, as we've touched distribution of wealth, and really due to time constraints, we've not covered everything. But obviously, we think all of these are quite important and really require further debate and discussion. As the future table, if you were to, and we really encourage you to do, if you were to go through a future table exercise, this is what you would see, that each of these variables have alternative development paths, i.e. values. And obviously our society, and I can demonstrate this in particular with global warming. Our societies would all look very different should our approach to climate change be one of mitigation, one of adaptation, one of uncontrolled development, or even outright denial, who knows? So combining these values with other potential values, we see that future is by no means determined, and in fact very much in our own hands should we choose to act. And not to scare you, but this is in fact the sample table we have compiled over the course of spring to really also give light to our own thinking as to the future of cash. It inspires you, since we hope inspires you to see the multitude of possible.
We have a number of questions on the use of metrics and the difference between the use of cash as a transactional payment instrument and the use of and the measure of cash in circulation. Now, naturally, they are very different metrics. But I'll say this thing, and Franz can correct me if he wishes. The first thing is the only real clear and factual measure of cash is cash in circulation. Measuring the use of cash in the share of transactions is only an estimate. And the best tool we have to make those estimates are payment diaries, which are expensive to run, and provide a historical analysis. So yes, the level of cash in circulation is very different from the use of cash in transactions, but it is the most accurate proxy we have. And as underlined by Franz, cash is far more than a payment instrument. It remains an important store of value. Franz, anything to add?
Yeah, just to add, you're right. It's finally cash in circulation, and that's what we know. We know the figures. The central banks know how much cash is in circulation. In most countries, they also know how much cash is in circulation outside the banking system. Nevertheless, you need some metric with which to compare evolutions over time, evolutions between different countries, comparing countries internationally. And it is important who holds cash, for what reasons he holds cash, where cash circulates. That's important, but that's very difficult. It's a difficult task, but nevertheless, we should try to do it. But the most common and at least the true notion of cash is cash in circulation. That's true.
Antti, there are a number of questions around the topic of cash and the risk of spreading corona. I'm going to say this is simply that if cash was effectively a vehicle in spreading corona, we would all be in hospital by this time. And a number of central banks have provided a whole range of scientific evidence showing that cash is no more a factor than door handles, cards, or pin pads. But the question, Antti, is more about the perception. And do you think that the perception that cash still raises hygiene issues will and can change behavior in the future?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because okay, good. So in principle, I think that finally the perception can be only changed when we can show the results of studies. So that in a way, I mean, Didrik already referred to this misinformation. So that originally headlines got information that cash can provide a vehicle for this virus, and naturally it was then confirmed that that is not the case, that it's the similar with any other object which is regularly handled. But I think that it's only based on studies we can fully get out of this perception, and in a way some studies which clearly show the results of academic institutions or independent institutions, and hopefully we will receive that kind of studies during the course of time.
Didrik, there's a question for you on.
May I add one sentence?
Go ahead, Franz.
The Bundesbank has not only put their own view on the topic on their webpage, but also asked virologists and epidemiologists about that topic. And they put their view on the webpage too. And they said, first, that due to the material of new banknotes, like the Euro banknotes, this is not possible that the virus would be spread via banknotes. It's more spread via plastic cards or the terminals where you put in your PIN code. And second, they say that the number of positively tested people with corona would have been much higher in Germany if it would be spread via banknotes.
Thank you, Franz. We have a question from Amy Burr. Franz, you encourage NCBs to promote the use of cash, whereas Antti encourages NCB to guarantee the viability of cash distribution. What specific advice would you, or what specific behaviors would you advise? I would say both, but Antti?
Yeah, no, well, like my slide of the 141 currencies showed, different currencies are in very different situation. So that in principle, naturally, we have on the one hand those countries where cash in transactions, the share of cash in transactions is still more than 90%. It's clear that in those countries, one of the reasons is that there are no other payment instruments which most of the people can use, and clearly those central banks have great efforts to provide infrastructure for other payment instruments. Then on the other side, we have the central banks, in particular in the Nordic countries, where the share of cash is already very small in transactions, and naturally their concern is that can they keep the infrastructure? And like I said, in principle, there are only two options, either to do it with regulation or with some kind of subsidies. And I understand that that there is already research in this area that theoretically how you can arrange this kind of subsidized infrastructure. So in principle, I see only these two alternatives.
Franz, anything to add?
Yeah, perhaps one sense that I'm completely in line with Antti, and would say that, in my view, central banks should mention the unique characteristics of cash. It's really special, at least up to now. Maybe we have financial innovation or payments innovation in the future, where we can develop cashless payment instruments which have the same characteristics as now. And one of the really natural characteristics is simplicity. And so they should point to this unique characteristics and say that in this sense, cash is special and it's wise not to abolish it.
Still, Guillaume, if I may follow up, so that like we have noticed in several currencies, I look at the recent behavior, circulation behavior of several currencies, and it was often that there was a very high spike in middle March or late March when the restrictions started. So in principle, even in countries where the share of cash in transactions is decreasing, people would like to prepare for precautions for uncertain circumstances with hoarding cash. So if the central banks notice this, naturally they should prepare that it's also possible in the future.
I think that the main point that we were trying to make with this project is that the future of cash is not written, and we aim and still aim to adopt this futures literacy approach to try and look at the long-term future. This project is ongoing. It's also very open source, and should you be interested, you're most welcome to join, and please feel free to reach out to us for further info. The webinar is recorded, will be available within 24 hours. And we'll be holding the second part of this webinar on the 9th of June and the third on the 30th of June. And you've got here our contact details for further information. To summarize a few takeaways. First and foremost is the fact that we have seen a severe impact not only on cash, but on consumer payments during this pandemic, and the big unknown is whether this change in behavior will be short-term or whether there will be a more long-lasting shift. One factor that could drive to an increased use of cash in the future is the fact that with the recession, we could see more and more people switching to cash to use as a budget management tool. Thirdly, we've seen that that there is strong demand for a trusted, secure, universal form of money, and that consumers still view cash as a public good. We could see an acceleration of a trend that we've seen in the past, which is the fact that we're seeing increasing cash in circulation, but declining use of cash as a payment instrument. Last, there is a serious need to rethink the entire cash cycle to guarantee future access, acceptance, and resilience. In terms of policy, there are two options, which are regulation or subsidization, and possibly a combination of both. With that, I'd like to extend my thanks to Franz, Auntie, Diedrich, and I thank all of you for listening in, and I hope that the technology was partly acceptable. And with that, I leave you with a little drawing. Thank you very much. Hope to see you next time.
Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Guillaume.